Welcome to Beyond the Barrel, the podcast where we discuss philosophy from a layperson's perspective, armed only with our library cards and a couple dollars for late fees because philosophy books take so long to read. Thanks so much for joining us. In today's episode, we talk about perspectivism and how our individual perceptions of the world compare to objective, capital R reality. Hope you enjoy the show.
So Morgan,
Yes.
you were really excited to talk about perspectivism.
I am really excited.
Do you want to bring up our question for today?
Okay, so our question today, since we already kind of spent the last few episodes talking about the individual and what makes up a self, I was thinking, how does individual perspective shape reality?
Do you mean reality as a whole or individual reality?
Well, I think reality is something that we should probably define.
Okay, how would you define reality?
That's a loaded question. I think there's a lot of different ways to define reality, especially centered around perspectivism, because, in day to day life, we come across things like misunderstandings and two people having a different view on the same situation. Or, I mean, you'll even hear in crime reports sometimes, two people who are involved in a crime, two victims, will describe the perpetrator completely differently. So I think reality is actually kind of this flexible thing that we might not actually have access to because we have such a limited perspective as an individual.
That's an interesting thought, that we wouldn't have an accurate, what's the phrasing you used? It makes me think, was it access to it? We don't even have the access to that objective reality because we are so rooted in our perspective.
Yeah, I think so. Or at least I think it's something that is interesting to ponder.
Yeah, because in doing a little bit of digging just about perspectivism and the history, one question in the terms or in the realm of Nietzsche.
Nietzsche.
Okay, I can never get that one right. Is how is true knowledge supposed to penetrate one's perspective when it's so limited?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, because the whole of the universe is so incredibly vast, I mean, I think a good illusion for this is or I guess it would be a metaphor, but when the sun is up, we cannot see any of the stars until the sun goes down. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
So we don't
Truly.
even have access to seeing certain things unless there are certain, God, I can't even think of the word. Unless there are certain conditions that are met first.
Mm-hmm. And when we talk about the universe as this large, intangible thing, it's kind of naive of us almost to assume that our perspective is anything close to the true nature of reality.
So what is the individual's perspective of reality? I feel like the individual kind of lives in their own little world to a certain point. What do you think about that?
I think, like everything, it's a spectrum. I think that there are degrees of objectivity and being connected with an objective reality, if there is one. Because what comes to my mind is, community leaders and religious leaders who are so close to people in their community and so in touch with all of the suffering and successes, that if you have that breadth of empathy and empathetic experiences, you know more about that objective reality. You've seen more of it. But I feel like maybe the less you interact with the world and the more you stay within yourself and your own bubble, the more limited and warped your perspective or your individual reality is.
I absolutely agree with that. The more you actually go out and explore the world, the more you're going to know, the more you're going to see, the broader your perspective is going to be. So I totally agree on that. So let's also go back to, so we're talking about kind of subjective reality and also objective reality. Um, let's kind of talk about the difference between those two things. With subjectivity, that's kind of where we see a lot of the errors that are made just because of our humanness. We only have the resources that we have, and the resources that we have today are not even the same as they were 10, 20 years ago. Go back even further, we had even fewer resources to kind of build up this subjective experience of the world. And then when we get into objectivity, which I think objectivity is kind of like the goal of philosophy, or it has been historically, of finding an objective capital T truth of some kind.
Mhm.
And so, with all of this reasoning through our subjectivity, which is the only thing we really have, I think, because we can't exactly stand outside of ourselves and observe the world from a non human perspective. We do have to interact with the world through our subjective experience. And since we're trying to reach objectivity through our subjectivity, I feel like that's kind of too far of a gap for us to breach.
Do you think that's where practices like meditation start to come in? Because when you talked about looking at the world through, like a physical lens, you were interacting physically with the world. It made me think of meditation and reflecting on those experiences to gain a greater understanding of them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think meditation is like historically something that has tried to break people out of like their individual experience and kind of achieve a oneness with the universe. That's kind of been like,
Mhm.
that's kind of the goal in like Buddhism and some Hindu practices as well, is to kind of achieve that oneness, which I think, who's to say if that is an actual objective experience or if it's just another form of our subjectivity. But I think it definitely gets us closer to breaching that gap.
I think that's a really good point because a common thing in philosophy from Buddhism to transcendentalism, as you're probably now experiencing in your listening, is the concept of the one soul or the shared soul, or man, I wish I could remember what the transcendentalists called it, but almost want to say the collective self, something along those lines. And it's, the idea that the more time you spend kind of sitting with and meditating on the truths of life or the observed truths of life, the closer you get to that one soul or the more tangible it is to you. So tell me more about how this question kind of came about in your mind. How has it been kind of playing around in your life?
I think it pops up in misunderstandings, like kind of interpersonal types of things where I might have experienced a situation in a certain way, and another person who was a part of that experience experienced it differently than I did, because we're two different individuals with, different past experiences and different thought patterns and different personalities. And so, something that I think is a little bit flawed about humans is we sometimes project ourselves onto reality a lot. We might infer things that might not need to be inferred because it's something that's just kind of happening internally and not externally. That's kind of how it comes up in my life from time to time. But I also almost wonder sometimes in spirituality as well, are there spiritual beings out there that exist beyond our perception? I have no idea of gauging that at all. And I think anybody who claims that that stuff is capital T truth is a little bit misguided. Perhaps they're projecting a little bit. Perhaps they're inferring something that wouldn't necessarily be fair to infer.
Yeah, absolutely. Because as a pagan, I absolutely believe in spiritual things that we cannot necessarily see or things that we don't necessarily share a realm with. But I will be the first to say that there is no capital T truth to any of it. I am very much basing it off of what I feel and what I'm experiencing. And I think that is what all religion is truly. And to argue that it's truth, let alone start a war over arguing that it's truth, is just a waste of human effort and energy.
Yeah. And you actually kind of bring up a really interesting point about, kind of the feelings that you have, rather than, seeing a spiritual being in front of you. These kind of practices evoke certain feelings rather than, something that's actually more tangible. And I feel like whenever we have these kinds of conversations, like regarding philosophy and science and things like that, we kind of tend to dismiss feelings and that part of the subjective experience a lot more than we do the thinking and the rational part of our subjective experience.
You think that we focus more on the things that we can physically feel than the things we can emotionally feel? Like our
Yeah,
physical experiences are considered more valid than our emotional, mental, spiritual ones?
exactly.
I wonder why.
Me too. Because that's one thing about humans that I think is really special is like this whole spectrum of like emotions and feelings and like instincts that like we just kind of refuse to interact with, maybe partially because we don't fully understand them or how to apply those things to our lives. I'm not sure.
Mhm. Yeah, because I mean, it certainly makes it harder to contend with things that aren't as easy to touch or I don't know. I don't know. I wonder how the ways we limit ourselves also shape that individual reality that you posed at the beginning.
I mean, being closed minded is definitely not something that's ever going to reveal any kind of truth to you, you know?
And committing to one truth as absolute for all of it your entire life isn't going to get you any further than that one truth.
Yeah, truly. I mean, you can even apply this to science. There's a lot of scientific theories that we apply to our everyday life, but they're just theories. They're something
Mhm.
that is always being questioned, always being reevaluated, but that we kind of go about our day to day lives just accepting as the truth and the way things are.
You mean what? Can you give me an example?
Um, uh, sh- uh, String theory.
What exactly is string theory?
It's very complicated from what I understand. It has to do with kind of interdimensionality. A lot of people use string theory to support theories of multi dimensions, but I think it's like kind of its own brand of physics. It kind of defines the way that particles move through space and time differently than we had seen them in a past.
And so you think that's just an example of, or not just an example of, but an example of not necessarily proven truth that we accept as fact to make our daily lives simpler?
Yeah.
How do you think it makes our lives simpler? Not to interrogate you about your example, but I'm curious.
Well, I think whenever we take theories that are like kind of widely accepted within the scientific community and apply those to our lives, it makes things easier because, these scientists have spent decades observing patterns, making conclusions based on those patterns, and predicting outcomes of experiments based on those theories of patterns. And so it kind of makes the world a little bit more predictable. It makes it a little more navigable and a little less scary.
Yeah, and I think we have established in our conversations of identity that most things humans do are to avoid fear and discomfort.
Yeah, yeah. We
And
don't we
that's
don't like to be uncomfy here.
yeah, and that's why we stay in that individual reality for as long as possible often unless we are how do you think people like do you think that there are ways out of that individual reality? Do you think there are methods to apply to living an open-minded life? Or do you think it's just something that happens as you evolve as a person throughout your life?
I think both. But I think meditation and mindfulness, like you were talking about before, I think those things both lend themselves to creating an open experience to the world.
Mhm. Because I think it's kind of easy to see that a more objective focused reality. Well, there's that idea again of an objective reality. And I guess my question is, what is the goal here? Like, what, when considering our individual reality and what it means to us and how it interacts with the objective reality, what is the goal here to get the individual reality as close as possible to the objective reality, or just to accept that your perspective is valid while not infallible?
I'm not sure. I don't know if there is like any goal in mind with it. Because, I mean, on the one hand, we are striving for objective truth. We always have been, and I think we probably always will be. We want answers to all of these timeless questions. But I think the closest we're ever going to get is having a collective subjective reality, which is kind of like where all of our individual realities, think of it like a massive Venn diagram. Everybody's going to have their own individual experiences and perceptions of the world as it is, but there's going to be lots of overlap between all of those experiences as well. And that overlap is where we're going to have, like I said, that collective subjective experience of the world, which I think is as close as we're ever going to get to having an objective experience of the world.
I think that was very well said, and I agree with you. Yeah, it stands to reason that the the key to achieving a more objective reality would be to confide in others.
Yeah, for sure. You want corroboration.
Yeah, exactly. Do we want to kind of get into the resources now that we're kind of creeping towards the 20-minute mark?
Yeah, absolutely. What
Okay.
resources do you have to bring to the table today?
So when I did a little bit of digging on perspectivism, I went way back because it looked really complicated in a lot of ways, and I wanted the nuts and bolts. I wanted where exactly this idea originated from. And so it started with Nietzsche. We did this already, but help me.
Nietzsche.
Nietzsche. It started with Nietzsche building off of Tesch a German philosopher's ideas of exploring the divide between the real and apparent world.
Mm,
So apparent in this case being subjective, real in quotes being the objective. Um, and how he went about this theoretically was the idea of separating the consciousness, which is feeling and action. So more like tangible things, more like things we individually experience, and separating that from the specific theoretical knowledge of the world, which I thought was a good place to start. It was a good acknowledgement that these two things are separate. What do you think about that, Morgan?
I mean, I think it's a great jumping off point, just saying that, there's a difference between the two.
Mm-hmm. And so Nietzsche,
Mhm.
fuck,
Yeah. You
Nietzsche
got it.
built off this whole idea of separation with objectivity, and that's kind of where we get that phrasing in the first place, was this concept. And he really noted the deficiencies of each perspective and thought that they could be remedied essentially by comparing and contrasting them and seeing, like you said, what was different, what overlapped. And this wildly contrasted from Plato, or Platonian thinking at least, who noted that objective truth is in a non-perspectival perspectival realm. So essentially, in Platonian thinking, true objective truth is something completely removed from us. It is something that we experience through our own lens and not necessarily something that we can ever hope to achieve. It exists in a different realm from us. So I thought the contrast of those two ways of thinking were very interesting.
So Platonian thinking is more of like these two are separate things. The subjective and objective reality are two different things, and they don't overlap as much as we think they do. Whereas Nietzsche is kind of trying to find the commonality between the two of them.
Yeah, that's how I'm getting it as well, is essentially truth, objective truth and subjective truth, according to Nietzsche, can exist within the same perspectives. There can be overlap, and to understand them is to study their differences. Whereas Platonian thinking was, it's out of our hands, we can't even reach it. It's not for us, essentially.
I think
And
that's an important phrase to carry with us through life is like, that's not for us.
it's certainly a good one, and I think that is definitely helpful, especially in talking about reality. There are some things that belong in our subjective reality, and some things that maybe don't. Some things just aren't for us.
Yeah, like the bottom of the ocean is gonna be unknown probably forever, and that's fine. It's not for us.
It's not for us. Your food down there. Did you want to bring in your quotes from the Plato essay, or your thoughts on that? Because that seemed like really interesting and really exciting.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll start by going back to something that you had said earlier about empathy, which is basically kind of trying to view the world from another person's perspective, which I think that, doing that exercise of trying to enact empathy is going to bring you a broader understanding of the world, but probably not get you all the way there either. And I'm going to pull this quote. This is from plato.stanford.edu, and they have this whole database of like all kinds of essays. It's a great resource if you want to check it out. But this essay is specifically about understanding. And I'm going to pull this quote here. It says, quote, "It was also argued that reliving experiences, to the extent that this is possible, does not actually amount to an explanation of why the experiences happened. I could, after all, have lived through a series of events myself, but not been able to explain or understand them. So why would imaginatively living through someone else's experiences, to the extent that this is possible, automatically grant me understanding?" And I
Huh.
think that's a very interesting quote. This is kind of the positivist critique, which is something that it came a little bit after Nietzsche. This is more Theodore Abel and Nagel and Rudner, people like them. So it's still kind of like in the modernist field. But I think it's a really interesting take
Mhm.
that practicing empathy doesn't grant you any more understanding than living the experience yourself.
Hold on, I'm processing that. So, I guess I'm a little confused. So, experiencing something yourself and experiencing it through somebody else relaying that experience to you are the same thing, and are can be considered the same experience?
I don't think it could be considered the same experience, but I think the key takeaway is that, experiencing something firsthand for yourself is going to bring you a certain amount of understanding, and imaginatively experiencing something through someone else's experience is also going to bring you a certain amount of understanding, but neither of them are going to give you a complete understanding of reality.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot more sense to me now. It's not going to explain, like you said, why this happened to you, what the grander events at play that may have caused this situation are.
Yeah, exactly. Because you were saying earlier about how, whenever you just focus on your individual perspective, it can kind of leave you in a bubble and you're not really going to see the world as it is because you're seeing such a small part of it. So there's this argument that, broadening your perspectives, interacting with people, empathizing with people, trying to live the world through as many perspectives as possible is going to get you closer to objective reality. But it's actually kind of not, because our imaginations too are very limited. Our own subjective experience is very limited. So even though we do achieve a somewhat broader understanding, it might still be soiled by some of our own projection, some of our own biases, and those kinds of things.
Yeah, That's really interesting to think about, because one thing I had written down here was perspectivism can be seen as holding interpretations that are, of the universe. So
Mm,
we may not have a full understanding of the situation or the context at play, but all we have is our interpretation of the situation. And it's interesting because on a we have to find the balance between not believing it at all, that interpretation, and writing it off, or holding completely fast to it and only believing in that interpretation. Like, we have to find the balance of accepting essentially that this might be true. And that's frustrating to life is already frustrating enough without trying to incorporate that into your daily understanding of everything that happens to you.
yeah, for sure. I mean, if anything is consistent about life, it's it's that it's a balancing act, right?
Mhm.
And I kind of thought of a fun little metaphor here that might illustrate um, perspectivism a little bit better. Let's say you go to an art museum. There's this huge abstract painting on the wall. Everyone who looks at that painting, people say that art is subjective, right? So everyone's going to see that painting and it might take them back to a specific memory or a feeling or a state of mind. Um, and you can go to the museum by yourself, look at that one painting, gain that one perspective, and that's all well and good. Or you could go with a group of friends and then afterward go
Mhm.
have coffee and talk about what each of you saw in the painting, and you'll kind of get a broader understanding. But unless you talk to the artist themselves, you might not have the full picture of what that piece of artwork actually means or how it came to be or why it is even there in the first place.
Absolutely. Oh, I cannot wait to get into aesthetics. Because, interpretation plays such a big role in art, and we know how closely art and life are interlinked. We still contemplate the question of what comes first, what imitates which, and I think the only answer is both, because our interpretations of the world, inform our creations, and inform the way we interpret other people's creations. And you could argue that your life is a creation, and people's perspective of you and what you've done and accomplished is going to be completely different from your experience of having lived it and finding an identity in it.
Yeah, 100%.
So, do we want to kind of circle back to the initial question, and so we can kind of leave with like a takeaway, and then like a quote from the Plato thing?
Yeah. So at the beginning, we kind of asked, how does individual perspective shape reality? And, I still think it's a pretty loaded question,
Mhm.
even after this discussion.
Do you feel what would you say now? How would you answer that question now after going through all of this?
I think individual perspective shapes reality in so much as it shapes our experience of reality, but not necessarily that it touches reality itself.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. It informs our interpretations of reality, and it informs the way we interact with others within our own reality. But it there is an objective truth, like you said, that we're humans have been searching for since the beginning of time, and will probably search for the end of time, unless we decide to practice radical acceptance and just be comfortable with certainty. But I think it's more likely that we'll continue to try to seek out a true objective reality. And I think that's just something that may be unattainable to us. I think we may just have to go about our lives, doing our silly little tasks, knowing that our perception of reality is the closest thing that we can hold to be definitively true, but that it's not infallible, and everybody else has their own interpretation of their own reality they have to contend with and operate within.
Yeah, 100%. And I think before we close off today, kind of, in this conversation of like talking about empathy and the individual perspective and how we all work together whenever sometimes our Venn diagram doesn't quite line up all the way, I think it's really important to go forward and like just believe people when they share their experience of the world with you, right? I feel like
Mhm.
if you just go around dismissing other people's beliefs and experiences just because it's not a part of your subjective reality, you're kind of closing yourself off to what could potentially be an expanded version of the truth.
Yeah, absolutely. You're actively stopping yourself from getting closer to any sort of objective reality.
Yeah. So believe people, believe people.
Thank you guys. Have a great night.
Thanks for listening today. We hope you enjoyed the show. If you'd like to join the conversation, find us on Twitter and TikTok at BTB Philosophy. We would love to hear your thoughts and suggestions. Stay curious, stay open, and stay kind. We'll talk to you next time.